Hello, old sport. You finally made it to chapter 7, and I love this chapter because this is the point of the story where it all goes down. Everything that the book has been building towards with Daisy and Gatsby and Tom and Myrtle and George, all of that comes to a head in this chapter. So it may be the longest chapter of the story, but it's definitely the deepest, most action packed part of the whole narrative. The events of this chapter happen on one really hot day at the end of the summer. By the way, do you notice how the weather often relates to the events, like all of the rain in chapter 5? And now the chapter with the most tension is also literally the hottest. And this chapter is normally broken down into 3 essential events: lunchtime, downtown, and Myrtle's death. So, lunchtime. Daisy invites Nick and Gatsby over to her home for lunch, although it seems strange to Nick that Daisy and Gatsby want to risk having the relationship become exposed. Gatsby and Daisy have been spending lots of secret time together, but if they're together and affectionate in front of others, it will be a secret no longer. There's an obvious tension between all of the characters throughout the chapter, as so much of what each character knows goes unsaid. But at one point, Daisy looks at and speaks to Gatsby in a way that Tom immediately recognizes as a sign that Daisy and Gatsby are way more than friends. And from that moment on, everyone is very much on edge, hardly in control of what they're doing or saying. It's also worthwhile to point out, again, that Nick is privy to Daisy and Gatsby's secret, but he's said and done nothing. Once Tom decrees that they're all going downtown, there's a very interesting exchange between Gatsby and Nick. Remember that throughout the story, Nick has continually drawn attention to the hypnotic quality of Daisy's voice. Well, Gatsby puts the nail on the head when he bluntly says, "Her voice is full of money." This really strange statement about someone's voice indicates a great deal about the nature of dreams and beauty in this story. Money lays heavily at the center of Gatsby's conceptualization of his self-identity. If he can win the heart of the golden girl, then he has aspired to a very lofty, rich achievement. Now that we think about it, everything about Gatsby seems to be yellow, right? His house, his car, his flowers, yellow, yellow, yellow. This also casts a new light on how genuine Gatsby's love for Daisy is. Is it about the girl or about the money in her voice? Come to think of it, I don't know if there's much else to love about Daisy. Anyhow, the second major part of this chapter involves our characters heading into the city. Tom, for some reason, drives Gatsby's yellow car. He stops at Wilson's gas station and learns that Wilson plans on taking Myrtle away. Myrtle, meanwhile, looks out the window and sees Tom in this gorgeous yellow car. I wonder if she heard him betray her and tell Wilson that he'd sell him his car if that meant getting the money he needed to move away. Nick notes that Tom is noticeably flustered, and his wife and mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitately from his control. When in the city, Tom openly confronts Gatsby, and the progress of their altercation has a very interesting course. First, you have to remember that one of the key differences between Tom and Gatsby is that Tom is old money, and he outright says that Gatsby is Mr. Nobody from Nowhere. The course of their conversation involves Tom essentially making a case for why Gatsby is nothing more than a crooked gangster. And it turns out that Gatsby earned his money by being a frontman for a bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking syndicate. He is the gangster turned businessman. Not only that, but Tom makes Gatsby's attempt to get Daisy to erase the past look foolish. Daisy cannot truly admit that she never loved Tom, and for Gatsby this is devastating. In my own opinion, I can't believe how Daisy vacillates so easily in the scene between Tom and Gatsby. I mean, pick a guy already and stick with him, girl. Tom exposes Gatsby for the low-life criminal he is, and even Nick looks at Gatsby and genuinely believes he had killed a man. The more Gatsby talks, the more desperate he appears, until Nick sees that his whole game is up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, unsparingly toward that lost voice across the room. Gatsby had attempted to rewrite his past, to rewrite the story of his life. Perhaps a noble aspiration, but when confronted with the brash rock of Tom and the hopeless superficiality of Daisy, his dream evaporates in one afternoon. And it's no accident that right here, right after this massive confrontation, Nick realizes it's his 30th birthday. You see, underneath the story of Gatsby is Nick's own coming-of-age narrative. In his initial introduction of himself in chapter 1, Nick tells us that he learned a harsh moral lesson from his summer in New York. And it's this scene where he sees the beauty and desperation of Gatsby's struggle and the reality of Tom's cruel malice. Finally, there's the third part of the chapter. On the way home from the city, Gatsby takes his own car with Daisy, since Tom no longer sees Gatsby as a threat, back home. Myrtle, who at the beginning of the chapter saw Tom driving the yellow car, apparently dashes out into the street in an attempt to beg for Tom's deliverance, but is run down and killed. On the way home from New York, Tom, in a fit of triumph, had Gatsby drive his own yellow car and just allow Daisy to accompany him. We initially believe that it was Gatsby who committed a hit and run on Myrtle, which might at first feel like a sort of fulfilling and ironic slice of revenge against Tom. But it's not until later that Nick realizes the truth. It was Daisy who was driving. And even though she knew nothing about Myrtle specifically, there are two ways to look at this moment. First, we might see this as an even more fulfilling, though unwitting, act of revenge on Tom's adultery. Just as Tom deprived Daisy of Gatsby, so too will Daisy deprive him of Myrtle. But there's a second way we can look at this. We can read this as yet another act of destruction committed by Tom and Daisy in collusion with one another. Tom stomps on George and consumes Myrtle, and then Daisy does away with her. And who is watching over this whole horrific scene? The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Even though these eyes seem to be brooding in passive judgment over the whole scene, seeing everything but failing to interact or redeem this scene from the Valley of Ashes. These eyes will get a little more attention in Chapter 8. And finally, the chapter ends with a very sinister description. Gatsby is secretly loitering outside of Daisy's house in case Tom tries to bother her about that unpleasantness this afternoon. Gatsby's image is pitiable, and he's playing the part of the noble hero guarding his woman and sacrificing himself for her. He is, after all, taking the blame for hitting Myrtle, but of course Daisy doesn't really care about him. By this point, Nick is so disgusted with Gatsby, but is even more piqued when he sneaks a glance in the Buchanan's window and says, "There is an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together." So Tom and Daisy here, according to Nick, seem to have this connotation of being criminals together. What do you think about Tom and Daisy here? Who is guilty for Myrtle's death, and just how much does your opinion of Gatsby change, if at all, now that we know everything about him? But don't stop now. There's too much going on to wait around. So go, read some more. Until then, see ya, old sport.